Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Neil here from EDM Tips for another iteration of Tuneful Tuesday. So, typically, we're going to be hosting these live, as most of you already know, but as it happens this week, I'm going to be traveling during the time of the typical stream, which is 9 a.m. Pacific time on Tuesdays. So, I decided I'd go ahead and record this session in advance so you guys can all still get some feedback on your tracks. Of course, for those of you watching, I still encourage you to drop your comments in the chat, in the comments of this particular video, just because I'm sure everyone that has submitted a track would certainly value a little bit of extra feedback. Of course, any support for any songs that you guys might particularly like. For those of you tuning in for the first time, if you're interested in getting feedback on one of your tracks, all you need to do is be enrolled in either the Radio Ready program or the EDM Tips Accelerator, and near the top of your course login page, you should see an option for track feedback. If you click on that lesson, you'll see the link to submit your track. And then every single week on Tuesdays, I'll queue up the list from the past week and we'll give them a proper review. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to get straight into this. There are a lot of submissions to go through because last week we had a little bit of a unique Tuneful Tuesday as well with the announcement of the remix competition winners. So we're back on track with the standard Tuneful Tuesday process right now. So I've got about 26 tracks or so to get through, I believe. So we'll do our best to work through it in a timely manner. Like I said earlier, guys, as you're just watching this recorded video, definitely feel free to drop your support, drop your suggestions in the comments here. I'm sure the folks that have submitted here would definitely appreciate it. So up first, we've got a track submission from Real coming out of our Radio Ready program. This is a new idea. They're not sure about it, but let's see what we've got. I'll go and play it, a couple minutes, skip around a little bit and see what we can come up with. So yeah, this first one from Real, that's Daydreamers with the Future Rave ID.
Listen to your soul.
Very nice sense of space to start this track out.
Love one another. Listen to your mind. Listen to your soul.
I love the reverb and the echo that you've got on that vocal. That really helps fill in the space and add a lot of interest and texture. To be honest, I don't really have any complaints so far.
Your soul. Listen to your heart. Love one another.
Awesome melody there. Great sense of repetition at the start. A little bit of evolution going up to those higher notes and then repetition. And then that little turnaround at the end. Fantastic work with that melody writing. Cool, so that pre-drop snare I think could be a little bit thicker and more powerful. The drop is working out quite well right now. I like the added noise. I do think we still need a little bit of an increase in energy from the build beforehand. So consider, maybe pitching up this lead an octave or layering it with another synth in the drop just for a little bit of extra brightness, a little bit of energy. I can hear that you did that in the second half here, and that's a great start. Like if you were to start the drop with that new melody that you introduced in the second half and then expand on it even further in the second half, I think that would be the big winner. So to, recap, the core of this idea is fantastic. I definitely think it's something that's worth seeing out and growing out to the full arrangement. I just think we need to focus on adding a little bit more energy to the drops, particularly in that lead synth. So a little bit more brightness, another layer, a higher octave put in there as well. Anything to just help add a little bit of extra energy to that lead melody, and you should be golden. Yeah, great work with this track, so let's give it up for Real there. Up next, we've got a track submission from Ruben coming out of our Accelerator, looking for just some general feedback, so let's see what we've got with Recto 5 Feet on a Mirani. Yeah, okay. Or I guess the name of the track is free, whatever. Just a little bit. Great sense of evolution, movement, and texture throughout this intro here. I might want a little bit more saturation on that bass line from the start. It's currently kind of sitting in a similar sense of distance and space as the rest of your elements. So we need one element that really does just come out a little bit more in thickness and takes our foreground, takes our attention. I think your bass line is the best option for that to start this track out. Cool, so I think one thing I'd like is coming up out of this build-up, like, you have a really nice increase in energy across that transition point, but after the transition point, we don't really meet that energy quite as much. So I'd recommend, maybe beefing up this second part of this drop just a little bit, either through, again, like another higher octave layer on this main bass riff could work out nicely, or some sort of other melodic synth to hit on the downbeat. I like the addition of this vocal. The biggest thing that's standing out to me so far actually across this track is our use of the stereo field. So you've got a great sense of width with your atmospheres and some of the percussion layers and such. The majority of our primary content is sitting right in the center, right? Like the chord drums, the bass, the vocal, and even parts of the melodic phrases. And that's creating just a lot of busyness in the center and a lot of open space on the sides. So I would recommend either taking the bass and making that a wide synth bass, or taking your vocal and using a tool like the isotope vocal doubler to spread that nice and wide. That'll create a lot of clarity among those primary elements, and it'll help fill out your sense of space across the track as a whole. So hopefully that does the trick for you. The big thing, again, focusing on that sense of space and width. But otherwise, great work with the track, great vibe, sound selections on point, compositions on point. So let's give it up for Ruben there, coming out of our Accelerator program. Up next, we've got a track submission from Jeff Wykoff, also coming out of our Accelerator. He's saying, hey Neil, new track here. The first drop is meant to have limited low end as the whole song is a build-up. Curious about the distortion and effects I put on my pitched up vocals at the end as well. Hope you enjoy. Yeah, let's see what we've got with Hesitate. And since, it kind of sounds like you want me to hear the full thing, I'll skip around a little bit to make sure that we get to the end too. Awesome texture to start things off. I think I would like a little bit more movement by the second half of that intro right there. Like, the very beginning started out really nice for the first, 3 or 4 seconds, but I would like some sort of Foley or percussive layer or some sort of evolution in this main atmospheric pad-like layer to happen, because otherwise it's just kind of a long time to go for about, it looks like 16 seconds on that same sound. Let's see what we have kind of coming up closer to the drop. Cool, so I like this drop, and I'm fine with the lack of super heavy bass at this point. However, I do think there's a little bit of an imbalance in the song, favoring the upper mids around 4 kilohertz to 6 kilohertz a little bit too much, given the lack of bass. So, since you don't want to give away the full bass quite yet, which again I'm totally fine with, I would recommend dialing back some of the presence on our upper lead synths, like that main bell pluck that you have. Past that, reducing the volume of this distant atmospheric layer that has a lot of top end energy to it will also help. So just dialing that particular atmosphere back, probably 4 to 6 decibels, maybe shelving down a little bit of the high end will help create a little bit more of a balanced sense of space. Let's see what we've got going on here in the end. So by this point, you've got a little bit more bass weight, it seems. I do think we benefit from some sort of dedicated, sustained sub at this point. The overall feeling of the track is very smooth, very flowing. And we've got that in the high-end atmosphere, but the low mids and the mid-range are a little bit more, rhythmic in nature. So to complement that high-end smooth atmosphere, I would add a nice sustained low-end sub bass to help add a little bit more low-end weight and create that smoother vibe. Vocals coming up. So the distortion and the effects that you have on that vocal are definitely really cool right now. There's a lot going on. I don't know that it necessarily fits the vibe of the track exactly, as it almost sounds a little bit too distorted, a little bit too mangled up for how beautiful and smooth and melodic the rest of the track is. I also think that given the fact that you have this very airy and consistent atmosphere, there isn't as much space for that vocal texture to live. So my personal recommendation would be to dial back those effects a little bit. Alternatively, if you're a big fan of them, then I would say dial back our atmosphere a decent amount, especially when that vocal comes in, and let that vocal be the atmosphere. Let it be the kind of primary interesting texture, and anything else that can be simplified at that point will help us pay more attention to the vocal. All right, well, let's give it up for Jeff with Hesitate there. Up next, we've got a track coming from John Holland out of our Accelerator program. Looking for just some general mixed feedback, please. Looks like it's semi-mastered. Says a fairly simple track with a single main theme and one extended variation. Awesome. Yeah, let's see what we've got with letters. I like the effects and the general composition of the intro. I think we've got a little bit too much of a high-end weight to it, given that we're kind of coming into a low-energy section to start. And you're building up that energy, but like from the very start of the track, I'd probably shelf down some of that high-end, take away a little bit of that extra top-end energy. Awesome melody here. The composition is fantastic. The one thing I'm noticing is the groove of the melody doesn't quite fit in the pocket of your kick bass influence. I think it's coming in a little early. Yeah, I do think it's coming in just a little bit early. So I would dial or just kind of shuffle the melody a little bit further to the right. See if you can get a little bit more in the pocket with that one. I like this mid-break section. I think the drums could come up just a little bit in presence. I think the volume is fine, but if you get a little bit of a high-end coloring EQ boost on them, that'll help give a little bit more perceived presence on those drums. That'll just help really drive the energy of the section. I do think the snare needs to come up a little bit in volume, though. Nice drive, nice energy. The pulsing of the bass is fantastic. I would like a little bit more thump on the kick. In my subwoofer, I am feeling a little bit more energy dedicated to the sub bass than I am to the sub of the kick. So I would just add a low-end coloring EQ boost to the kick to help it stand out a little bit more, drive a little bit more punchiness and maintain that down. Otherwise, fantastic job again. That melody is absolutely killer. Let's give it up for John Holland there with Letters. Up next, I've got a track submission from Srikanth coming out of our Accelerator program as well. It says, last week you shared your thoughts and asked me to make the below mentioned changes. Could you please give this updated version of the master a listen and let me know if these changes are fine or not? Additionally, if there are any more changes required, let me know. And then he's just kind of like listed a handful of those changes. Cool. So actually, I know, Srikanth, if you're watching this, I know that you and I have also like met in a one-off version, which, just a quick aside for those of you watching that haven't been through the Accelerator yet, that is one of the bonuses of the Accelerator, is that you get a few one-on-one calls included with the program, as well as consistent one-on-one homework feedback. So I know Srikanth and I have met since he uploaded this and, submitted this track to Tuneful Tuesday, and we've covered a handful of these, but I'll go ahead and review it nonetheless, just so that, the rest of you can kind of understand where the places of benefit would really happen. So let's see what we've got with Srikanth's new idea. Fantastic sense of width right from the start on these percussion, especially with that really kind of tight and filtered kick in the center. It gives us a lot of attention to detail on that high end side, and it also creates a really nice sense of width and stereo space so that we can build out on that and fill in that extra space down the road in the song. I think the one thing I might actually call out is that the percussion might be just a little bit too loud relative to everything else in the mix, so it might be worth dialing those back just a couple or a few decibels. Because they're out on the sides by themselves, we could even, dial them back as far as like 10 to 20 decibels and we'd still hear them really clearly, but we want to make sure that we maintain enough energy, which is why I only say, 1 to 3 decibels of reduction should do the trick on those. The groove of the melody feels just a little bit rushed. I'd say for that particular layer, again, if you can just kind of nudge the whole thing over to the right a couple of ticks, that should probably fit in the pocket a little bit better. Nice sense of space. I love the harmonic tension that you're building in here right now between the chords, the melody, and this like occasional ding-like layer that's coming in. Nice. So I'd say for the drop, I do want that drop to hit a little bit harder. So maybe a little bit more power and energy coming from the low end between the kick and the sub bass. Just bringing that up just a tiny bit should help. Past that, I think you could probably bring up the volume of your chords just a touch, at least on the downbeat. So, maybe you set up some volume automation so they're a little bit louder at the start of each measure and then fade out. Or you could adjust the amplitude envelope in your synth itself. Something to just bring us a little bit more power on the downbeat of that drop. Would be nice. Otherwise, fantastic sound choice. Again, really great work with that percussion and setting up this really nice wide sense of space. So let's give it up for Srikanth there with his new idea. Up next, we got a track submission from Steve Smith coming out of our Accelerator saying, "Hey Neil, could you go from about 120 onwards, please? The arrangement was tricky with this one as I seem to run out of mileage with the sample, so any pointers on the mix, particularly the bass and low end, and any other general pointers would be great. Thank you." Yeah, let's see what we've got with What a Difference Love Makes. So one thing that I would look to, start right away is that given that we've got a very loop-based song here, right, between that kind of wide sonic layer and then this vocal that's coming in, we need to focus on creating variations in that pattern as much as we can. So what does that mean? Maybe add like a tape stop effect every once in a while. Maybe add a reverse to that particular sample, or like rather swap out the sample with a reversed version of the sample. If even for like a couple of beats here and there, that'll help keep it really nice and fresh when we do have it repeating. Mix, honestly, you're pretty well balanced right now. I do feel like the bass is a little bit thin in general, so just saturating that up a bit would probably help. And the one thing you want to make sure of when you're saturating it to thicken it up is that it doesn't become over-expressive in the low mids, so you might need to couple or follow that saturation up with a little bit of reduction. I think it's around like 180 to 220 hertz. It won't need much because you really are pretty well balanced right now. Did hear just a moment of tonal conflict in there, so just zoom in and check your notes among your different layers and the fills. Make sure everything's aligned. I think that was like right around like the 238 mark or so. The other thing I'd say about this bass is this particular high note that you're sitting on during that moment. It doesn't quite sound like atonal or, out of sync with the rest of the track, but it's lacking a little bit of thickness and body on that particular note. So it might be worth looking for a different synth sound for the bass itself, something with a little bit more of a consistent body to it. Otherwise, great work of a great usage of the stereo fill. I love how wide your synth-like layers are, leaving a lot of open space for that vocal in the center. Despite the fact that there's a lot going on rhythmically with these various layers, I can kind of hear everything. So great work there. Let's give it up for Steve with What a Difference Love Makes. Up next, we've got a different Steve coming out of our Radio Ready program, saying, just, "Hey, Neil, looking for some general feedback, please." So yeah, absolutely, Steve, you've got it. Let's see what we've got with Second Test. Nice texture and tone on this guitar. Perfect for an intro. The one thing I would say is that we need to fill in the space a little bit more. So maybe messing around with some extra reverb throws, some delay throws on there, or even maybe using like a tool like Crystallizer to get a very textured delay on there would help kind of fill in a little bit more interest and movement in that intro. So I really like this new kind of wide mid-bass synth layer that you've added in there. It's got a great pattern to it. The one thing I'm noticing is there are moments of tonal conflict between that bass and these upper mid chords that have been playing throughout this section. I think the bass is a phenomenal start, so start with that and use the notes of that bass to figure out what chords you should play. And you could probably just use like the notes of the bass as the root notes of the chords and build out, proper triads and sevenths from there. So I am getting just a little bit too much conflict in those upper mid chords. Same comment kind of applies right here. That final chord that was playing like right at 113 sounded like a diminished chord, which is just a little bit too tense for modern music. So I would swap out that chord again, using the bass line as our foundation to see what sort of notes we should build off of. Cool, so I love the two different layers of the bass. Like you had that deep, wide layer right there and then this top mid layer. However, the timing of their envelopes was just a little bit off. So I would either adjust the timing of the MIDI notes or dive into the synth and adjust the envelope so that they're really starting and ending tightly with each other. That'll help create that feeling of like those multiple layers really gluing and gelling together as though they were a single bass. Awesome. The other thing that I'd look out for is just a little bit more thickness and presence on the drums. They sound pretty quiet, and I'm not sure if it's just because of the volume or if it's because of the drum samples or recording technique used. They sound just a little bit distant in general, like there's a lot of room reverb baked into them. So if you can kind of dry those up a little bit to bring them a little more forward in the mix, that will favor a more modern sound. Awesome. All right, well, great work, Steve. Let's give it up for him with Second Test. Up next, I've got a track coming from Pascal coming out of our Radio Ready program saying you can skip the intro and start at 1 minute and 2 seconds. So yeah, let's see what we've got with PK Nears Walk On. I think 1 minute, 2 seconds. Nice, great sense of space here from the start. Really well-balanced stereo field, super nice and wide. The one thing I'm noticing though is that this wide bass that's causing the majority of our width is creating a little bit of muddiness in the low mids on those sides. And I think it's probably just a little bit muddy in general, even if it weren't wide, but especially on the sides, that becomes a big risk. So my recommendation would be to take that particular bass and just carve out a little bit of information between, say, like 90 and 180 hertz. If you just shelf that information down by a couple decibels, that should clean it up a decent amount. So the kick sample that you've got, there's nothing like inherently wrong with it, but I think there's an opportunity for a slightly more textured kick to live in this mix to help create a little bit of a deeper vibe, a little bit more of a vibe that matches like this kind of natural feel of a lot of the rest of your music. So I would look for either a top end kick to layer on top of what you've got, or just replace the current kick with something, like I said, that has a little bit more texture to it, a little bit more top end focus. So I like this new melody that you've got coming in. I would bring that melody up in volume, and I'd probably turn down the volume of this wide bass just a little bit at this point. We've been hearing that bass for quite a while, so the melody is going to be the new, interesting, exciting thing for a listener. So bring that melody up, dial that bass back, and then on top of bringing up the volume of the melody, I would also probably add a little bit of saturation and high-end coloring EQ to bring out a little bit more presence and sparkle in it. So at this point, it might be worth either taking out that wide bass that's been playing throughout the majority of the song, or filtering out the low end of it. So I can kind of tell you're filtering out the high end of it. The risk with this is that we're still leaving a lot of low end energy in the mix during the break. And typically our break is going to be the opposite of that. It's going to have a little bit more mid-range and upper high information as opposed to that low end drive. Otherwise, again, really great job. Fantastic sound selection. I think the melodies, the harmonic content, and everything else that you've got in there is spot on. So let's give it up for Pascal. Great work with that one. Up next, we've got a track submission from Maxwell Young coming out of our Accelerator. Looking for some overall feedback, and he's saying this is the first half of the song, around 3 minutes total. So if possible, please play the entire way through. Yeah, we'll get through most of it for sure. Since still working on the arrangement, but the overall theme of the track is in place. No processing other than creative choices. The low end may sound too boomy as my room isn't acoustically treated. Hope you enjoy and thank you. Yeah, let's see what we've got from Maxwell's lasting impression. So cool textures to start. I will say this, that they're a little bit too distant and a little bit too quiet. Anyone listening in like a moderately noisy environment just won't be able to hear this. And given how long your intro is, like we're 20 seconds in now, if they're, for example, trying to listen to this at a cafe while doing some work, they're probably going to skip to the next song by this point because they won't have had something to focus on to really draw their attention. As soon as you bring this little top end pluck in though, you're fine. So maybe just start the song at this point. I love this pulsing synth that you've gotten there. I think there's a little bit too much wetness of reverb on it though, so dial back that setting a little bit. Bring that element nice into the front. And then consider a little bit of width on that chord pattern as well. I do think it's a little bit narrow. Fantastic vibe once this drop gets going. I love the amount of noise that you built up during the build so that we get to this really nice, smooth, chill contrast moment when the drop hits. Perfect. Was hoping for a little bit of like a shaker or percussion to come in at that moment, and that's exactly what you gave me. I do think that shaker's a little bit loud. This pluck layer that you've got going on there, I like its rhythm, I like what it's doing. I think it's just a little bit thin because it has to sit on top of that main really thick chord layer that you've been having play. So I would recommend, just maybe saturating that a little bit further, maybe extending the length of the envelope just a touch on that main pluck as well so that it becomes a little bit thicker, a little bit more consistent with the chords. See what you got kind of going on near the end. Love that new melody that's come in. I think it's a little bit too soft of a sound. Maybe, a lot of saturation would probably help out with that and once you get to the kind of mixed down stage. Alternatively, maybe layering it in with just one other sound to help it really carry the foreground. Because at this point, the listeners become very familiar with the background textures that you've got. So we need something to really stand out there. But phenomenal vibe, great groove going on, especially once that drop started. So let's give it up for Maxwell with Lasting Impression. Up next, we got a track submission from Philip Esser coming out of our Accelerator program. And he is also looking for some overall feedback. So let's see what we've got with Philip's I Feel Lonely. Beautiful start here. Great use of the delay and reverb on that vocal.
Heartbroken nights filled with nightmares.
I love how the guitar was off to the right. You had the vocal added in the center, and then with this new female verse, we have this like lead off to the side, the left side too. Fantastic job. Love that low layered vocal at that point too. I think this clap is a little bit too thick and strong of a clap for this point in the song. Maybe finding a slightly like tamer, less layered, less noisy clap would fit the vibe a little bit better because we're still building up the energy. For these vocals, now that we've kind of taken away our rhythmic element, I think we need to lean into that atmospheric feeling. Let's spread this break vocal nice and wide. So I think what you've got going on in this drop is a fantastic atmosphere. It's a fantastic background for something else to live on top of. But I think we need either a vocal at this point or a little bit more of a dedicated lead synth to drive home our focus. Compositionally, it all works perfectly as a background for something else, but I feel myself wanting something more. And that could be because, you know, during our intro and our build, we had that vocal, and that's creating a lot of a sense of presence and something being right here in front of us. But then the drop, you switch over to this mostly spread out sort of content, so we lose that kind of core focus that we built up.
I would dream about the end of the world. I would see the heavens big.
Great work on this verse as well.
I feel the end is near. I will sit here and I'll watch.
Sweet. I'm gonna just like skip ahead, see if these final drops do anything differently. Cool. Yeah, I think, you know, my comments stay the same. I'd say just focus on getting a little bit more energy in the drops via some sort of like lead foreground melodic element, whether that's a vocal, some different lead synth, or something to really drive home that presence. Otherwise, beautiful track. I think that intro and those verses are like as close to perfect as it really gets at this stage. So great work there, Phil. All right, up next, we've got a track coming from Sanjay out of our Accelerator program. And he's saying, hey, Neil, I made this track yesterday and I only did a little mixing this morning. I just want feedback on the sound for further mixing, arrangement, and anything else you think could improve this track. The most important times would be 20 seconds, 2 minutes, 3:30, and 4:25. Yeah, absolutely. So let's kind of skip around and see what we got with You Can't Use Me. Nice groove going on in the drums. I think, especially because you're opening up with just the drums, I focus on getting a little bit more width in those top drums so we fill out a little bit more of that stereo field right from the start. It'll also help clear up a little bit of extra space and clarity for the drum layers themselves. Love the space that you've got going on. I think your sub relationship is in a good spot. I would bring up like the upper mid layers of the bass, so somewhere around like that, it's like 100 to 300 hertz primarily. I would bring that up just a little bit further. Let's see what we got going on around 2 minutes. So this melody that's just coming in here, I heard it was creating a little bit of tone conflict when those other chords were playing at this time. I will say it's not quite as like deep and dark of a vibe as the rest of the track kind of seems to lend itself to. So it might be worth reworking the notes of this melody. The sound itself, though, is absolutely fantastic. Let's see around 3:30 what's going on. Before I do, though, really nice work with that new percussion that's nice and wide there. That sounds fantastic. At this point, I might suggest replacing that snare with like a clap. You're at a break in the energy, and that snare maintains just a little bit too much drive and power for this moment. Let's see what we got going on at 4:25 next. Nice use of that high drone note. So going back to the concept of stereo width, that drone note would be a perfect element to be spread nice and wide. It's got some width to it, but it is mostly in the center of the mix. And there's already a lot going on in the center, so we might as well move that kind of drone note off to the high sides. I'm a big fan of the vocal and your use of that vocal in this track too. Awesome. All right, well, great work, Sanjay, there. Let's give it up for him with You Can't Use Me. Up next, I've got a track submission from Gordon coming out of our Radio Ready program saying, hi, Neil. Newest track, made some changes from Feedback Friday. Still need some work to do. Any feedback and suggestions, welcome. Yeah, absolutely, Gordon. Let's see what we got with Lost in the Airwaves. Nice use of Foley. I love that kind of distant bird chirping sound. great sense of space. So the one thing that I'm noticing right from the start is that the pads have a little bit more high-end energy and presence than the melody itself did. So it's probably going to be worth either filtering out some of the high-end or at least applying a high shelf reduction above, say, like 3 kilohertz or so to most of the pad information and the chord information from the intro. On the other hand, the melody that's tucked in there, it's a great melody, but it's a little bit too quiet. So I would bring that melody right up and perhaps either layer in another sound with a little bit more brightness or open up the cutoff filter on your envelope, on your synth here, so that that melody that's been playing throughout this intro has a chance to stand out a little more. As a whole, I think I'd also like a little bit more punch and clarity on all of the drums. So a little bit of saturation on the drums across the board to help thicken them up, particularly on the kick. I think I want to bring that low end up a decent amount and sidechain your various synth elements more heavily against the kick. I want to ensure that we're getting that nice consistent thump and power from the kick that really is going to drive most of the instructions. Nice work with this little break section. Again, I do think I would like a little bit of the high end of this wide atmospheric synth that's been playing to be taken out. And then I like this crash that you've got, but it ends a little bit too abruptly, so consider adding some reverb to it so that it has a little bit of a smoother tail out. Yeah, the big thing for me, I think, is really going to be all about getting that kick to really drive things forward. I think the melody is close. Like, the rhythm is really solid. A lot of the notes are fine, but there's a couple of notes that don't quite create the most compelling pattern to it. It's not quite on the line of tonal conflict against the background, but it is probably worth messing around with just the notes of your melody a little further. See if you can come up with something that's a little bit more gelled with the rest of the track. I think the reason why this one isn't working is the melody's just jumping around a little bit too much, playing too many unique notes throughout the phrase. Otherwise, though, great work. Like I said earlier, great use of space, great use of evolution in a lot of your sounds. So let's give it up for Gordon there with Lost in the Airwaves. Up next, I've got a track submission from Dimitri coming out of the Accelerator. Dimitri says the drop is at 158. This was my energy for the remix contest. I didn't get feedback on the stream, so posting it here. Hey, good call, Dimitri. And, just a little shout out to anyone else that submitted a track for the remix competition. If you weren't one of the ones that were highlighted on the stream, but you'd still like some feedback, the Tuneful Tuesday is a great place to get that. And now that the competition's done, there's no rules against submitting this particular one. So, yeah, absolutely, Dimitri. Let's see what we've got with you. Let's kind of skip ahead a little bit so you can hear the build into the drop. Good use of space here. I love the atmosphere. I think this pluck synth that you've got is a little bit too thin, so some extra saturation across the board on it would be really nice. Maybe a little bit of mid-range coloring EQ to help give that synth pluck a little bit more body as well. Great use of that breath and that reverb throw. I think that sits really nicely. The timing of those U's is just a little bit off. It sounds like they come in just a touch early. Cool, so with this drop, I love these super wide super saws. Those have a great texture, great sound, and are mixed pretty much perfectly. The kick is also in a pretty good spot. The snare's in a pretty good spot, but both could use a little bit more saturation and thickness. The snare in particular would benefit from a little bit more top-end brightness, and then the kick would benefit from a little bit more low-end thump. However, the biggest thing that I'm hearing in this remix is that we need a little bit more presence on the bass line. If I listen carefully in there, I can hear that bass, but I would say your kick is at roughly the right level, those chords are roughly at the right level, the vocals at the right level, but the bass is probably 6 to 10 decibels too quiet. So I would bring that bass right up. The other thing, I can hear that you've got a hi-hat in there, but the hi-hat's also a decent amount too quiet. So I'd bring up the hi-hat volume, and then also look for a little bit more of an active rhythm in the hi-hat to really drive a little bit of extra energy. as most of the rhythm that the hi-hat is currently providing is already being satisfied by the relationship with the chords. So I would look for more of like a 16th note, a little bit faster of a pattern in the hi-hats to make it stand out and add something new. One final thing, and this is, like a relatively advanced thing, but I do think, it'd be a good touch. Oops, let me pause this. Is on that like atmosphere that you've got going on, a little bit of like manually automated auto filter, just a subtle bit to occasionally take away some of that energy and then occasionally bring it back in, will help create just that extra layer of evolution across this track. All right, well, let's give it up for Dimitri there. Up next, I've got a track submission coming from Steven, aka Liberty Jack. Steven saying, this is my third production and my first in a deep house sort of genre. I'm looking for general feedback on the track. Thank you. Regards. All right. And then, Steven's coming out of our Radio Ready program. So let's see what we got with Cream Teas and Marimbas. Love the name. Great use of space and interest right from the start. You've got that nice kind of core set of drums in the center, but that really nice wide sense of space coming from this synthy pluck layer. And I'm getting just the right amount of width coming from like the low end and the bass too. So on these first couple of chords as this piano is coming in, I am getting a little bit of mud, not quite tonal conflict, but I think there's just too many low notes playing. So consider switching up the notes of those chords or revoicing them to a higher set of notes in general so they're living a little bit more distinctly from the kick and bass. The other thing that they're competing with is that like marimba-like layer that's been playing. Again, it's super close. It's not quite a problem, but, maybe consider taking out or just de-emphasizing the marimba anytime the piano is playing so that our ears aren't quite fighting against those two different melodic patterns. Great groove and vibe at this section. One thing that I'm kind of noticing across the board here, Steven, is that I think the reverb is a little bit too heavy, just kind of across everything. Every element just seems a little bit more distant than I'd like it to be. Except for your sub bass. Your sub bass is actually in a perfect spot. Cool, so at this point, again, because we're in a little bit of a lighter energy section, I think the current snare with the amount of noise and splash it has is just a little bit too energetic. So some ways we can kind of dial that back is a little bit more of a filter on it, maybe adding actually a little bit more reverb to that snare to help wash it out, push it a little bit further back in space. And that only applies to the break. I think in the drops, you could actually bring up that snare just a little bit further. So just a little bit more volume, a little bit more saturation on that snare drum. And then I still think a little bit more reverb just in general on that snare would be nice, but almost everything else needs to be dialed back a bit in reverb. Cool. All right, well, fantastic work. Again, for being your third production, you are in a really, really great spot. My third production sounded nowhere close to that. So let's give it up for Steven there. Up next, we've got a track submission from Colin coming out of our Accelerator program. Colin saying, hey Neil, looking for some general feedback for the track I submitted for the production competition. Awesome, another one of these. Let's see what we got from Colin's Inner Voices. Great groove, great sense of space, good vibe. The biggest thing that I'm noticing right from the start is I'd like a little bit more of a pump on the bass line every time that kick comes in. It doesn't need to be like fully ducked, but I'm not quite getting the like overall measure long phrase groove that I'm looking for. So just again, a little bit of like a side chain compression or an LFO tool, not set to 100%, not completely tucking away that first hit of the bass, just ducking it a little bit more to give us an up and down rhythm, I think will help out a lot. The same thing kind of applies to your percussion and hi-hats. You're really close. It just needs that little bit of extra duck to give us that macro sense of the groove. Nice use in the break.
I will find you. I will find you in the darkest places of my love. I'll protect you from the dark.
Really nice job with this drop so far. I love the vocal and the texture that you've got on the vocal. I love the vibe it creates with the bass. My biggest thing is this like kind of rolly pluck that's playing every once in a while. The sound itself is actually fantastic, but it's playing at the same time as that. So I think instead, if you were to put this like fluttery synth that you've got in the spaces of the vocal, it would work 10 times better. I'm gonna just see if there's anything going on different in the final drop. Same thing here, right? Like that new melody that just came in is playing it largely at the same time as the vocal and at the same time as these plucks. So it's just a lot to take in at any one given moment. But if we just switch up the ordering of those for a little bit more of a call and response, you'll be in a really, really great spot with this song. I think the final thing is that your sub bass is in a pretty good spot. You can maybe just get a little bit more volume on the sub bass, but then a little bit more than that on the kick drum. You're again very, very close, but I do think that kick could come out with a little bit more thought than ever. All right, well, let's give it up for our Accelerator program. He's looking for feedback on the break and drop and around 220 and saying, this time I used a lot of rolling bass to be more uplifting. Tell me, what do you think? Yeah, let's see what we got from My Melody by Yaniv. Love the amount of reverb that was going on that piano there for a second. I think almost in comparison to that piano that was just playing, this new set of synths that have come in are just a little bit too dry and aggressively plucky. So I think the easiest way is probably to just add a little bit more reverb to them, wet that up a little bit. The other option would be to maybe compress them a little, not with a lot of makeup gain, but just for the sake of kind of taming those attacks a bit. Cool, so I think this whole section's working well enough. I think the biggest thing that I'm lacking in there is like a sense of warmth and body during this breakdown. So maybe consider adding like a little bit of a thicker mid-range style pad to help, add that little bit of warmth, or just saturating what you've got there a decent amount across the board. So this rolling bass is fantastic. The top end texture of it sitting perfectly in the mix. The low end has a really nice, pattern and groove to it. I think that's definitely the highlight of your track. I think compared to that, though, everything else feels just a little bit thin. Because you've done such a great job with the bass, the top end melodies and leads are just a little bit dissonant, a little bit thin in the mix. So I would just focus on adding loads of saturation to those top end melodies to kind of complement the thickness that you've got going on in the low. Compositionally, though, it's all working out quite well. I love the melody that you've got implied on the top end with this like repeating bell-like chord layer. And then this mid-range implied melody that you also have is working really well with that. So great job compositionally. I think the big thing is just focus on saturating a lot of your synth elements to thicken them up. Awesome. Let's give it up for Yaniv with My Melody. Up next, we've got a track submission from Dan Draycock coming out of our Accelerator. Looking for feedback just starting at 132. So let's see what we've got with Siempre. Great groove going on there leading into this little break section. The percussion and drums in this one are just hitting fantastically. Like perfectly mixed, great sense of space on them, good use of the stereo field. I think that vocal might be just a tiny bit bright and loud at that point, so maybe just filter down, or rather shelf down some of the high end with an EQ, and that should take care of both the volume and brightness. Something about the timing of that vocal hit and the piano hit wasn't quite right. The piano seems to be in sync, so my guess would be like that vocal right at this like 220-ish mark or so. See if you can adjust the timing of that, get that to fit a little bit more with the downbeat of the piano. You know, one thing I'm actually noticing about the drums is the whole kit does feel a little bit weighted to the right here. Earlier in like the break section and stuff, I really liked it. At this point, I'm not quite getting the energy and the central focus out of that that I need. So my recommendation would just be, you know, solo your drum kit, kind of repan it until that kick and the snare are hitting right in the center. Or if you want that snare / clap layer nice and wide, then feel free to make it evenly wide. But I think right now we're just leaning a little bit to the right side. Love that like little layered organ that you have on top of the piano. Those two are complementing each other really nicely, and you're getting a phenomenal vibe as a result. I think the final thing is that you could probably get away with a little bit more saturation or coloring compression to the bass line just to help thicken it up that little bit further. Awesome. All right, up next, we've got a track submission coming from Tommy G out of our Radio Ready program saying, hey, it's all experimental. It's 6'4" meters. So yeah, let's see what we've got with this Game of Thrones remix. Cool warlike textures on those drums there. I hear the chord progression kind of being inferred here. That's working pretty nicely. I think there's a little bit of low, mid, mud to them, and it sounds like you've got a couple of layers playing at this time. What I would probably do is just in those various layers, take out a couple of those lower voices, those lower notes, and just let like the strings be what's responsible for giving us our, deepest notes. You're still going to, communicate that full frequency spectrum across your multiple layers, but it should clean up the mix a decent amount. Love the experimental vibes in here. Normally I wouldn't be for a panning drum and percussion line the way this one is, but given that it's an experimental mix, I think it's working well enough. I think one thing that might make it work a little bit better is if you keep the top drums and maybe even the toms panned, but you get your kick drums kind of consistently rooted in the center. That'll give us just like a central body to keep on returning to. In this whole section, and even a little bit in the drop, like I could hear the melody and I could recognize it, having seen the show myself. But I would recommend doing what you can to bring out that melody a little bit more. So I'm not entirely sure if you, just like ripped the stem or something else of the sorts, and this is a sped up version, or if you, transcribed and wrote this down all yourself. Either way, the best way to probably get about, bringing this melody out further is to transcribe that melody and have another dedicated string cello-like layer play that. And then you can saturate that a little bit more, bring out a little bit more of the top end with the coloring EQ, and that should help it cut through the mix and really drive this track forward. Sweet. Overall, though, really, really cool take on this. Love the experimental vibe. I think you did a great job pulling it off, especially given the, the weird metering. And yeah, past that, just, fantastic work. All right, up next, I've got a track coming from Rajesh, coming out of the Radio Ready program, saying the first drop is about 1 minute in. So yeah, let's see what we got with Through These Eyes. So further ahead. From what I heard of the intro, nice work. There was a good amount of, movement on the sides. I love this like kind of strum-like layer that you got going on, giving us a lot of ear candy, movement and interest, and helping kind of define what that stereo field is going to be. This noise might be just a little bit too loud relative to the other layers, so I would just dial back that noise at probably about 4 to 6 decibels. Great contrast, going from this really smooth build up to this nice bouncy drop. I would love a little bit more definition on that bass line. So what I mean by that is a little more saturation to thicken it up, define those upper harmonics a little bit more. Then past that, potentially tighten up the envelope a little bit more so that we get a little bit more aggressive of a pluck, a little bit more bite on each of those notes, because it is a really rhythmic and grooving bass line in there. So anything that we can do to really highlight that will make it stronger. Clap layer that you've got in there I think is like the perfect texture. I think it's a little bit too quiet in the mix, so I'd bring that up a decibel or two. And then if you find the top end starts to stick out a little bit, which I have a feeling you might, just shelf that down with an EQ. One other thing I'd like a little bit more of in this version is just a little bit more depth in the mix. So I can hear everything really clearly because you've done a great job with the stereo field. You've done a great job of choosing elements that fit well with each other. But for the most part, they're all roughly sitting the same distance away from each other. So, whether that be through automations in the mix, like occasionally making some elements louder and some elements quieter, or just defining a couple of key elements, like maybe like melodic rhythmic synth that you've got playing during the drops, could just be a little bit louder and a little bit more present, meanwhile taking down the volume of those atmospheres, those noise layers, and just making those a little bit more distant. That should create a better sense of space in this mix. Otherwise though, fantastic writing. Again, the sound selection is on point here. You've got everything defined in a very clean vibe, so really great work, Rajesh. All right, up next, I've got a track submission coming from John O'Haddo, coming from the Radio Ready program, saying usual general feedback, mostly on the mix. If you can think of anything that I can add in to make it stand out more, would be great. Thank you. Yeah, let's see what we've got with Goodbye. Nice start. This shaker hi-hat hybrid thing that's playing off to the right side of the mix is a little bit loud. I'm perceiving it as closer to me than the kick and the snare. And if anything, they should be all roughly the same. So I might just, dial back that shaker a little bit. So I think with this one, you've got a totally fine intro. It'll work for a extended mix. I do think you could probably get to the point a little bit sooner though. Like maybe bring those chords in by the 30-second mark or even the 15-second mark. I think it took a little too long to get to the main idea. Composition is spot on. This vocal has a little bit of like low mid build up around 900 hertz, so a little bit of multiband compression to kind of smooth that out would probably help. Past that, maybe a little bit of fresh air to bring out a little bit more of that airiness. For those of you who don't know, or John, if you're not aware, the fresh air being like the Slate digital plugin, it is a free plugin. It's great at bringing out a little bit more airiness in vocals. So I think the overall mix is sounding really, really good balance-wise and frequency-wise. The biggest thing to me is the stereo field needs a little bit of expansion. Most of the mix is largely sitting kind of right in that center band. So I think like the pianos would be a great opportunity to have those spread nice and wide. What else? Maybe a little, a couple of those percussion layers just with a little bit of extra width will help clear out a little bit more space for that vocal to live in the center. Overall, though, fantastic composition. Once again, great groove, great sound selection. And like I said earlier, like the levels of your mix and the general mix are in a great spot. So let's give it up for Jono with Goodbye. Up next, we've got a track coming from Steve out of our Radio Ready program saying, "Hi, Neil. I was going to enter to the remix contest, but had no time to finish it up. But I would like to hear your opinion on it. Thanks." Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's see what we got with I Was Gonna Enter. Love the name. I love this percussion intro. It's, far from just like a standard simple pattern, and I love the way you've played with a bunch of different reverb patterns and stuff. It's definitely got me intrigued so far. That vocal fill, super cool. It was just like one too many chops too busy. So if you just simplify that the tiniest bit, you'll be in a great spot. So I think most of your drum kit's working really well. The one element that I probably changed is the kick drum. And the reason is most of your percussion here is relatively like mid-range focused. In comparison to like a very high, shiny, tinny sort of hat, you've got a lot of body to these. And the kick that you've got is a relatively high-end focused textured kick. So you end up having a lot of overlap between those two. Now you could potentially sidechain your percussion more heavily against the kick for a little bit more of a clear punch. But even so, I think we would still run into a little bit of conflict and overlap in vibe. So I would just look for like a slightly deeper, tighter, maybe even clickier kick. The groove and the composition here is totally fine. I think the big thing is the sound of that piano is a little bit thin to me. Same for this one kind of playing in the breakdown. This breakdown one is definitely sitting in a little bit better of a spot for the breakdown, but I would probably search around for a different piano sound for that drop. Something with a little bit more body, a little bit more energy to it. I love that second chord that you've got in there. It creates this like moment of tension that I'm, not used to hearing on that vocal, but I think it works really well. Cool. These chords in the drop, like the synth flutter style chord, like the main big one off to the sides, could use a little bit more saturation, a little bit more brightness on them, something that just helps thicken them up. The other thing that I'm not quite getting as much of that I'd want to is just like a dedicated bass line. So, whether that's layering in a bass line alongside those chords or creating your own new bass line pattern, I do find myself wanting a little more thickness and power from that low end. Awesome. Overall, great work, though. I love the switch up, love the vibe of it. So, yeah, fantastic work with that little remix flip. Up next, we've got a track coming from Paul Rochester, out of our Radio Ready program, saying, "General feedback, please. It's unmastered. Was going for a progressive / tin liquor vibe. Thanks." Awesome. Let's see what we got with Pages. Nice start. Perfect balance of like interest, movement, and simplicity. Those chords that are sustained allow us to hear that ARP pattern nice and clearly. And the stereo separation with that ARP pattern being on the sides and this vocal in the center gives us a clear view of each. So great work there. I do think that you probably left the vocal just a little bit too quiet and filtered. You could probably bring it a little bit more forward, open up some of that high end. Compositionally and evolution-wise, this is in a great spot. I think the biggest thing that I'd focus on for you, Paul, is just kind of enhancing the mix a little bit. Getting a little bit more thickness and energy out of our synths, and this is primarily going to come through a combination of saturation and coloring EQ to help add a little bit of extra shine. The other thing that I'd love a little bit more of is just low-end thickness in general. I have to boost myself a decent amount to start feeling the kick in the bass, so just some low-end coloring EQ boost to your kick to help add more thump and power to the kick, and then just bringing up the volume of your bass I think would be a good idea. This vocal, I think, could also, I said earlier, could use a little bit more brightness. This would be another perfect example of where fresh air would do the right thing to that vocal to give it that top end airiness and cut through the mix. So right here, since this, I'll call it a vocal chop-like melody that's sitting in the mid-range and kind of panning left and right a little bit, that's going to be the primary focus because it's the loudest and most clear in the mix and it has the most defined melodic content. So you have this mid-range bass-like layer. It's kind of like an upper mid-bass that's playing in the center. That upper mid-bass, I would filter out a little bit more of it just because the top-end energy of that is cutting through and it is pulling our ear towards it a little bit too much. So a little bit of a filter on that top mid-bass right in the center of the mix would be a good idea. Awesome. All right, well, great job, Paul. Let's give it up for him with Pages. Up next, we've got a track from Dan Westlake out of our Radio Ready program. Dan saying at 57 seconds is the bass at the right volume compared to the drums, and at 5:11 are all of the elements in their correct space in the mix at the most busy part. Resubmitted from last week because I forgot about the competition. Awesome. Yeah, let's see what we got here, Dan, with The Future That We Hold. Nice volume. Let's see what we got. So 57 seconds is the bass line against the drums in a good spot. I know that's not what you're asking, but I would like a little bit more mid-range coloring EQ on that synth pit that just came in. Just give it a little bit more body. So I think the bass line could probably come up just a little bit. It's definitely audible. It's not far too quiet. But at this moment, it's the one thing that's going to be grabbing our attention, especially because the listener should be familiar with the drums. So I would just bring that bass right up. Another thing that could probably help is creating a little bit more stereo separation in this mix. It's not that there's a problem, but the bass line is, it's got a little bit of that kind of central body, but it's mostly right down the middle there. And same thing goes for the drums. There's a little bit of width to them, more so than the bass, but they're all kind of right in the center. So because of this textured filtered bass sound that we've got, I think either making that wider or making the drums a little bit wider would help make both of those clearer in the end. I think that final chord that's implied in the piano is just a little bit off note-wise when you go up to those higher set of notes. So maybe just consider reworking that to a different set of notes there. See if you can find something that gels a little more closely. And then let's check 5:11. You'd ask if all the elements are in the right spot. Good use of this vocal. One thing I'm noticing is there's a little bit of tonal conflict between the vocal and the piano primarily, a little bit with the bass in there as well. I can almost guarantee, though, that it's all coming from the piano. So I would just rework the notes of the piano to make sure that we're staying not just in key, but really matching the implied chord that's going on between the vocal and the bass line. Mix-wise, our levels are in a pretty good spot. I think this goes back to a similar comment I had earlier where there's just a lot happening in the mid, so once we add the vocals to it, it only becomes that much harder. The other thing that might help is just a little bit more dynamic range in the track. So maybe taking down the volume of your pads and your reverbs just a little bit, bringing up the volume of that vocal, and any of these synth hits, like that trumpet kind of stab that just played. All right. Fantastic work, though. The groove is on point. The vibe's on point as always, Dan. Let's give it up for West Side Angel with The Future That We Hold. Up next, we've got a track coming from Braum out of our Accelerator program. And his feedback is, Hi Neil, I've added low end focus to my master to make the kick pop more through the mix, lower the atmosphere sounds, and lower the imaging. What do you think about this master? So this is a track that Braum's been working on with us through a lot of the Accelerator program, I believe, if it's the one I'm thinking of. And, some feedback that I often give to people that are in the mastering stage is that the reverb comes up a little bit too much. We lose definition in the kick. And we often have a little bit too much width when people start pushing an imager. So those were all the last feedback points. It sounds like he dialed them in. Let's see what we've got with House Music by Vamos. Nice, good standard mix. And I'm going to skip ahead a little, just kind of take us past the mix in. Great groove going on. The balance between the kick and the bass at this point is in a good spot. I know we're not quite at the drop, but it's still working out.
It was also performed at clubs called the Warehouse and Powerhouse. However it got its name, it's one of the hottest things going, and as Jay Levine reports, it may only be a matter of time before house musicians become heroes in their own homes.
Cool, so this is working out really well. I think from the imaging perspective, you're golden here, Braum. I think the low-end focus might have been pushed a little bit too much because I'm getting a really nice, clean thump on the kick. I'm no longer feeling quite as much of the roundedness of the bass as I remember hearing in the past. Let me reevaluate that, actually. You know what? I might take that back. I actually think you're in a good spot, but I do have a feeling that the low end in general could come up just a touch. Yeah, looking at my meters and my subwoofer and everything else, I would say just add a little bit more of like a low end coloring EQ boost across the entire track, and that should help out.
But people, they don't really care how you make it. They just want it to move them. The movement on the dance floor, it's a release for people. And that release is so primally important that people will take it in many different forms.
Everything else in here, I think you're golden here, Braum. This is working out really, really well. You've done a phenomenal job with the sense of space. Those drums are nice and crisp and punchy. Those synths are sounding great and wide in their own sense, in their own space in the mix. Aren't too thin, aren't too loud. Yeah, I don't really have anything else but a sign off for you at this point. So, like I said, just a little bit more thickness on the low end, and you're golden. Let's give it up for Braum with house music. All right, up next, we got a track from Ad coming out of our Accelerator program saying, "Hi Neil, this track is a short one, nearly 4 minutes. A bit different from the others up to now. Could you please give feedback on the track itself, the mix, and the logical fit within the genre?" Yeah, let's see what we've got with Sequence. Or I guess Afterparty would be the name. So to make this intro just a little bit more interesting, I would either add some sort of like Foley or atmosphere, or just simply add a delay with a very filtered delay that just kind of captures most of the high end to that main rhythmic chord sound that you've got. That'll just help fill in the space, add a little bit of ear candy to the mix. Cool, so I love the width that you have going on in these various keys layers. Everything else is a little bit too central in the mix. So we almost have this disconnect where we have these super wide key layers, nothing really right here, and then a bunch of stuff right in the center. So I think looking to the drum kit and kind of adding some imaging to that, spreading that out a little bit wider will be super helpful. That'll also clear up a little bit more space for the bass. And I think you'll probably at that point be able to dial back the bass just a decibel or so in volume. It's almost a little bit too loud. It's going to eat up a lot of headroom as you push this into louder volumes. So if you clear up that space and can allow the bass line to be a little bit quieter, I think you'll be in a good spot. This filtered trumpet, this muted trumpet that you've got playing is fantastic. Well mixed in the track. Ooh, nice switch up with the drums. I think one thing that I would like to hear of is a little bit more volume from the drums as well, so some extra saturation to thicken them up, maybe a little bit of high-end coloring EQ boost to help the top end cut through the mix more. So I'm feeling a great groove and nice sense of power on the sub bass. I'm not quite getting a thump of a kick, so whether it be through, processing the drum loop that you've gotten in there to give us a lot more low-end thump, or just layering in your own kind of dedicated 4-on-the-floor house kick with a nice solid low-end thump to it. Either way, that'll help give us a little bit more drive and groove to the overall track. Otherwise, I'd say you're in a fantastic spot here, so Great job here. Let's give it up for Adrian with Afterparty. All right. Up next, we got a track from Renee coming out of our Accelerator saying, "Hey, Neil, hope you're good. Could you please give me some feedback on my break and transition into the pre-drop and drop, starting at about 4 minutes to about 5:30? You could also please check the overall frequency distribution. Thank you very much in advance." Yeah, Renee, let's see what we've got with the day. All right, I think you said around, like, what was the timestamp? 4 minutes to about 5:30. Yeah, that'll do. The first thing I'm noticing, that chord layer that just kind of pulsed out behind the piano would sound great with some width to it. The reason why is, like, you know, it's just kind of naturally atmospheric, it's evolving, and it's sustained. So compared to everything else, it's relatively low in priority, and it's a great element to then just be part of the atmosphere. Awesome groove and vibe building here. It might be worth, like, opening this up in the low end a little bit more to get a little bit more low end drive with this. We obviously don't want to give away the full power, but I think we need a little bit more low end weight to that build. And now I'm getting a great sense of low end power, so great job with the drop. The kick and bass balance is right on point. Great groove between those two. So the biggest thing for me right now is I'm kind of struggling to know what I should be focusing on right now. Should I be focusing on the drums? Should I be focusing on, like, these synth background melodies? Should I be focusing on the vocal melody? And the reason why is because they're, one, roughly all sitting in the same sense of space or distance in the mix, but two, they've also, you know, they're sharing some moderate frequencies together. And then three, we're not really getting, like, a clear side chain motion between any of them. So I would say pick your most important element out of that. And if that changes from section to section, that's fine. But for example, let's just say you decide the drums are the most important part here. And I might opt drums just because of how atmospheric the rest of the mix is. Add a little bit of saturation. Again, I keep going back to it this stream. A little bit more high-end coloring EQ boost to help give that a little bit more presence. But on these drums in particular, actually, you won't really need to drive the high end that much, but an upper mid-range coloring EQ tackling, like, the frequencies around, like, 1 to 3 kilohertz should actually be a really nice touch. Awesome. Let's give it up for Renee with The Day. And last but not least, to close this off, we've got a track coming from Eton, Spiro out of our Accelerator program, saying, "First go at this genre, just looking for some general feedback. Thanks as always." Yeah, let's see what we've got with The Night the Sky Went Dark. It's a cool name. Nice Foley sense of texture. I might suggest, like, throwing an imager on that raindrop sample and just spreading that out even wider. You know, the way I like to think about it is, like, if you're standing in the rain, it's not coming out in front of you. You're not hearing that sound in front of you. You're hearing it all around you. So it's almost impossible to push too much width into a sound like that. I do love the way you grew the bass out from there, though. That was a fantastic introduction. Texture-wise, I think I'd like a little bit more, like, grunginess or saturation to this bass line. If you've got the decapitator, then just throwing that on there and driving it just up until the point of us getting a tiny bit of distortion, I think would add the perfect amount of texture. The other thing that I would say about the bass is that I'm not quite getting the cut of the kick through it. Now, the top end of the kick is sitting great in the mix. That's cutting through nice and clearly. But on my sub, I'm not really feeling that thump that I'd be looking for. So you could probably bring up the volume of the kick drum just in general a couple of decibels, but then particularly on the low end, I would also boost the low end of that kick a little bit further, and then sidechain the bass more heavily against the kick so that we get a little bit more of a pulsing, pumping feel. That's going to be one of the number one things to help with the danciness and groove going on. Cool. Nice transition into the break. The one thing that I would probably adjust is that like vocal-like sample that played right at this transition moment. It felt like it peaked just like a little bit too late. So if you can just shuffle that whole vocal swell a little bit to the left so that the loudest moment happens right at the end of that drop and then it fades out from there, I think that'll be a little bit better off. Really cool vibe going on in this midsection here too. Love the kind of atonality of the vocal against the bass line. I think that there's a little bit of clash there, but it's working in your favor to create that very kind of eerie, the night the sky went dark sort of vibe. I like how we kind of picked up the pace heading into this next section too. Nice. All right, fantastic work. Let's give it up for Eton there with The Night the Sky Went Dark. And with that, that brings us to an end of today's, I guess we'll call it a recording, stream, whatever you want to call it. Thanks very much for tuning in and for watching. I'll be stoked to get back live with you guys again next week, but glad we could at least get some proper feedback in and get things back on track after the remix competition. With that said, again, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for leaving your comments on the video if you chose to do so. As one last reminder, if anyone's watching and you're interested in getting feedback on your tracks, you do need to be enrolled in either the Radio Ready program or the Accelerator. They're both phenomenal programs. The Accelerator really being our marquee, like really in-depth version of that with a little bit more content. I shouldn't say a little bit. It's got loads more content. You get those one-on-one calls and personalized homework feedback every step of the way. If you're interested in checking those out, learning a little bit more about them, just check out, the website edmtips.com, and you'll see a couple of links directly to take you to the Accelerator page where you can learn more about the course. And when you're ready, set up a one-on-one call to decide kind of which course might be the right fit, or if joining us, at all is indeed the right idea. Of course, there's no obligation at the time, but we're always happy to meet new people, talk a little bit about music production, and see what we can do to help you out. So with that, thanks very much once again. I hope you all have a wonderful week ahead, and I look forward to catching you around the Facebook group, and 1 week again from now for the next Tuneful Tuesday. Cheers, everyone.